today. Recording is in progress. This is the latest panel in a series that we've been hosting between the Elections Research Center, which is in the Department of Political Science, and the State Democracy Research Initiative, which is located in the law school just across the way. My name is Barry Burden. I'm a professor of political science here at UW-Madison and director of the Elections Research Center. So this panel, as you probably sensed, is focused on the legal, ethical, and practical issues related to voting rights for individuals in the criminal justice system. There are questions about whether and how to afford the right to vote to the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individual. And these are questions that have generated, obviously, a lot of legal and policy controversy. States are doing a variety of things in this area, from liberalizing access, including people who are incarcerated, to taking away voting rights for people who have even completed their sentences. We'll hear some of that today about experiences in places like Florida, Minnesota, Mississippi, and elsewhere. This is one of the last groups in American society that is not fully enfranchised, as the right to vote has been expanded to additional groups over time: women, African Americans, 18-year-old and above. This is one group where there's still serious controversy and disagreement about extending voting rights. The issue has not been much dealt with in the state of Wisconsin, despite the fact that there is a severe racial disparity in incarceration rates and arrest rates in Wisconsin. It's one of the worst in the country. And yet conversations about that have not quite connected to the right to vote. So I'm glad we're talking about it in this state. We have a terrific set of experts from, I think, 4 different areas. We've really got lots of different disciplines represented here. So delighted to have them here. As I mentioned, this event is co-hosted by the Elections Research Center and the State Democracy Research Initiative. It is sponsored by Stafford Rosenbaum LLP, a law firm with deep roots here in Madison. I want to acknowledge our SDRI co-directors, Miriam Seifter and Rob Yablon. Thanks also to all the staff folks who have helped make this possible, in particular, Bree Wild, Evan Schumacher, and Jess Esplin. There is some housekeeping I need to run through before we get to the material. For those of you who are in the room, be aware the panel is being live streamed and being recorded. I believe it's also being co-streamed by Wisconsin Eye, which is our public affairs network here in Wisconsin. The event has been approved for 1.5 Wisconsin CLE continuing legal education credits by the Board of Bar Examiners. If you are attending in person, there are CLE sign-in sheets at the registration table just by the door. So please make sure you sign in there. If you are attending virtually, you're one of our Zoom attendees, please listen for the passcode, which I will provide just after 4 o'clock as the event is coming to an end. There will be a link in the chat to a Google form where you can enter that code to demonstrate that you were participating in today's event. You'll have to enter that code by 5 p.m. Central Time. Each of our panelists will take about 10 minutes to offer some opening comments. That will be followed by a Q&A, which I will moderate. Questions can come both from the audience we have in the room, using the index cards that are on your table and the cute pencils that go along with them. And we'll have folks coming around to collect those questions. If you are attending virtually, you may use the Q&A function on Zoom. Nothing else, just the Q&A function, and I'll be monitoring that to collect your questions. Feel free to submit questions along the way as the panel is happening, both in person and online. You don't need to wait till the end of the panel. You're more likely to get your question addressed if you submit it along the way, so it's ready as soon as the conversation is over. So thanks again to Stafford Rosenbaum. I want to introduce one of our representatives from Stafford. This is Doug Poland. Doug is a partner at Stafford Rosenbaum's Madison office, where he has focused on a variety of issues in law, appellate and complex litigation, much of it dealing with business disputes, contracts, environmental law, consumer fraud, but also elections and voting rights controversies in Wisconsin and elsewhere. Doug has led numerous cases in federal and state court. He was the lead counsel for the federal case Gill v. Whitford about Wisconsin's assembly districts that went eventually to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2019, and also the Lewis v. Bostelman case, which dealt with the extended deadline for absentee ballots in the April 2020 election here in Wisconsin as the pandemic was taking hold. You all remember that one. Doug co-chairs Stafford's election and political law practice group with Jeff Mandel. He and Jeff are also the co-founders of the nonprofit law firm Law Forward, which is focused on democracy issues here in Wisconsin. Doug earned his BA in history at Northwestern. We won't hold that against him. And his law degree at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. So Doug, the mic is yours.
Well, thank you, Barry. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon on an appropriately rainy and gloomy Friday the 13th. Hopefully it will get better from this point. As Barry mentioned, I'm Doug Poland. I co-chair Stafford Rosenbaum's, I'm a partner at Stafford Rosenbaum, and I co-chair our election and political law practice group. Stafford Rosenbaum is a full-service law firm. We have offices in Milwaukee and in Madison. And Jeff Mandel, as I had mentioned, is my partner at Stafford and also a co-founder of Law Forward. Jeff remains chair of the board of Law Forward as well, and is still widely involved in Law Forward. At Stafford, we believe that elections and the right of individuals to vote and the constitutional guardrails within which state, local, and federal governments must operate are at the heart of our democracy. In our view, our electional and political law attorneys have a deep understanding of both how government operates and the laws that apply to the elections by which voters choose their leaders and who will represent our interests as elected officials. Our attorneys have a breadth of knowledge and practical experience with Wisconsin law and federal law as well that is unmatched in Wisconsin. We really have the premier election and political law practice in Wisconsin. We help voters, candidates, municipalities, public interest groups, and the public navigate the thicket of laws governing voting rights in elections. We advise election officials, appointees, and others on how to comply with constitutional and statutory restrictions on government actions. And we represent individuals, organizations, and businesses that want to bring claims against governments as well. We are very pleased to sponsor the Election Matters program. We've done this for a couple of years now. We did it because we wanted to bring together the expertise in election and voting that exists within the UW Law School and also within the Election Research Center, the political science department, and in other departments, highly interdisciplinary. And so we're pleased to sponsor generally, and we're particularly pleased to sponsor today's program, which is going to address, as Barry had mentioned before, an incredibly important and urgent topic, both in this state and nationally. So with that, I would like to introduce today's panelists. First of all, Naila Awan, who is the interim co-director of policy for the New York Civil Liberties Union. Naila supports the full range of the NYCLU's advocacy work on issues involving racial justice, criminal legal system reform, voting rights, immigrants' rights, free expression, equal protection, and housing justice. Before joining NYCLU, Naila worked for multiple civil rights organizations and served on the legislative staff for Congresswoman Tammy Baldwin. Wonderful. Naila served as the first ever director of advocacy at Prison Policy Initiative, where she supported grassroots organizations and worked with policymakers in states across the U.S. to advance criminal legal system reform. She assisted campaigns to prevent new jail construction, engaged in administrative advocacy, and developed trainings and webinars to aid criminal legal system reform efforts. She also served as senior counsel at Demos, where her work centered on combating voter suppression and expanding access to the ballot for traditionally marginalized communities. In this role, she led a cross-functional project to end the disenfranchisement that people experience when they come into contact with the criminal legal system. She testified before Congress and served as counsel in numerous cases, including the Philip Randolph Institute versus Husted, a U.S. Supreme Court case challenging Ohio's voter purge practices, and Mays versus LaRose, a class action seeking to expand access to the ballot for voters detained in jail. Naila's work has been published in the Children's Legal Rights Journal, the University of Memphis Law Review, the Ohio State Journal on Dispute Resolution, and The Guardian. She's authored and co-authored How to End De Facto Disenfranchisement in the Criminal Justice System, Jail-Based Polling Locations, A Way to Fight Voter Disenfranchisement, Enfranchisement for All, The Case for Ending Penal Disenfranchisement in Our Democracy, and a number of other publications that I won't go on and list at length here because it is quite lengthy. Naila holds an LLM in International Legal Studies from the New York University School of Law, a JD from the Ohio State University's Moritz College of Law, and a BA from Miami University of Ohio. Welcome, Naila. Michael Macciola is a professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Macciola's work focuses on the social consequences of the expansion of the penal system, the relationship between the use of legal controls and demographic change in the United States, and patterns and consequences of criminal behavior over the life course. His areas of interest include social stratification, law and society, demography and ecology, aging and the life course, deviance, law, and social control. His current research projects examine historical variation in U.S. criminal deportations, as well as the relationship between incarceration and neighborhood attainment and racial composition. Professor Macciola teaches classes on criminology, delinquency, and deviance. His other campus affiliations include the Center for Demography and Ecology and the Center for Law, Society, and Justice. Professor Macciola earned his PhD from the University of Minnesota. He is a co-author of the book Prisons and Health in the Age of Mass Incarceration, published last year by the Oxford University Press. And thank you for participating today, Professor Macciola. Michael Morse is an assistant professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. Professor Morse studies voting rights, election administration, and the criminal justice system. His work combines empirical methods and novel administrative data with traditional legal scholarship. He has a secondary appointment in the political science department. Professor Morse has written extensively about the politics of felony disenfranchisement and the impact of fines and fees, including in the Journal of Legal Studies and Quarterly Journal of Political Science. His most recent work on the topic, published in the California Law Review, focused on a Florida ballot initiative known as Amendment 4, which sought to restore voting rights to people with felony convictions. Professor Morse has also contributed to current debates about voter access and electoral integrity, evaluating voter identification laws, voter list maintenance, and the extent of double voting in the American Political Science Review, Science Advances, and the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies. Professor Morse's latest article, forthcoming in the Boston University Law Review, focuses on how states have quietly forged a novel bureaucracy to coordinate voter registration through the Electronic Registration Information Center, perhaps better known to those of us in Wisconsin through its acronym, ERIC. Beyond voting rights and election administration, Professor Morse has also studied the election of local prosecutors across the country, publishing findings in the Iowa Law Review and UC Davis Law Review. He's written popular pieces about each aspect of his research for outlets such as Slate and Vox. Professor Morse is a proud Penn alumnus. After graduating from college, he earned a JD from Yale Law and a PhD in political science from Harvard. Professor Morse has served as a law clerk to the Honorable Myron Thompson on the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Alabama and the Honorable Marcia Berzon on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Before joining Penn Carey Law, he was a Bigelow Fellow at the University of Chicago Law School. Thank you for being here today, Professor Morse. And Michael Leo Owens, better known as Milo, is a professor and director of graduate admissions and placement in the Department of Political Sciences at Emory College of Arts and Sciences in Atlanta, Georgia. Professor Owens is a scholar of urban politics, state and local politics, the politics of criminal punishment, governance and the public policy processes, religion and politics, and African-American politics. Author of God and Government in the Ghetto, The Politics of Church-State Collaboration in Black America, his current book project is Prisoners in Democracy. It interrogates public policies and political attitudes that diminish the political, social, and civil rights of persons convicted of felonies, and it examines political participation by such persons to restore their political, social, and civil rights. He is also studying political dimensions and civic consequences of policing in the United States, including police militarization and officer-involved shootings, the political movement to push states to pass compensation laws for the wrongfully convicted, the community politics of public housing demolition, and the representation and empowerment of African Americans in municipal government, among other studies. A 2012-14 Public Voices Thought Leadership Fellow of the Op-Ed Project, his opinions and commentaries have appeared in media and popular outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian UK, National Public Radio, the Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. Professor Owens, who holds courtesy appointments in the Departments of African American Studies and Religion, is a former chair of the governing board of the Urban Affairs Association and former board member for Prison Policy Initiative. He currently serves on the national advisory boards of the Georgia Justice Project and Forever Family, as well as the editorial boards of Perspectives on Politics, Journal of Urban Affairs, Politics, Groups, and Identities. Plus, he is a volunteer with the Youth Diversion Program at the DeKalb County Juvenile Court. Professor Owens earned his PhD from the State University of New York, Albany. Welcome, Professor Owens, and welcome to our incredibly distinguished panel, all the accomplishments that we just ran through. Look forward to today's program. Let's please all give them a warm welcome.
Thanks, Doug. I now have imposter syndrome after hearing about our really impressive panel. So we're going to go to their comments, and we're going to start with Mike Masiola.
Yeah, thank you. I'll first say it's extremely unusual for all of us to sit, so I hope we do okay. It's been a while since we've sort of sat and looked out. I'm much more used to sort of walking and talking as we go, but it's an absolute privilege to be here. I'm always excited as a sociologist to hear and speak with political scientists and lawyers. And think broadly about incarceration, the criminal justice system, and elections. And I think we all know that elections matter, but thinking about how and thinking about the expertise of the other folks on the panel, sort of my background as a criminologist sort of brings a unique, somewhat of a different background to the discussion. And much of the discussion on sort of inequality in the criminal justice system is focused broadly on sort of the collateral consequences of incarceration in sort of broad terms. And it's important to note that there's a lot of legislative efforts around elections, and we're familiar with some of these these efforts. And other panelists are going to talk about them, but the intellectual tradition that I'm going to talk most about, or that I'll speak most about, is the sort of the consequences of incarceration, and think just a little bit about the scope and sort of get a sense of the sort of how big the impact, the scope of the justice system, its impact on elections. And if you buy what I'll say about the scope, then the impact on elections is pretty easy. Thank you. Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, go ahead and just pop it. Thank you, by the way. I'll just kind of look over. Evan, go ahead. And so I apologize, I'm at the bottom. Just thinking about, I'll close with some competing trends, thinking about what is happening with the justice system. We're seeing a move away, a trend towards de-incarceration, and we'll talk just a little bit about what that looks like. In the broadest sense, the expansion of the criminal justice system, and I think it's relevant to think about, is an interconnected series of federal, state, and local laws and initiatives. There's no one policy, there's no one initiative, there's no one jurisdiction. An interconnected web of initiatives that really changed the landscape of American life and changed American life chances. My colleagues and I, and I'm speaking of folks like Chris Hugan at the University of Minnesota, who was my advisor, Jeff Manza, Jason Schnittker at Penn, a number of folks, Sarah Shannon, Sarah Wakefield, in this sort of tradition. We argue that there's been the creation of a felon class in America. And that felon class captures millions of Americans, right? Those with a felony conviction. And in ways that many of us are probably familiar with, it has shaped the labor market and wages. We see differential outcomes in the labor market in terms of how much money people make tied to the criminal justice system, and educational inequality. In my own background, I did a dissertation on health inequality. I looked at patterns of disease infection and looked at how those are tied to the criminal justice system and rates of incarceration. And I'm always reminded what my grandmother, who couldn't speak English, God rest her soul, would say. I was very excited. I was like, Grandma, there's these really big effects of incarceration. It's bad for your health. And she said, like, you don't need to go to college to figure that out, Mike. She said, so there's this mean effect. And I think it's important to keep in mind, millions of people going through the justice system. There's a mean effect, right? That's a bad effect. But there's some countervailing effects. There's some intervention points. Lots of sick people are going to prisons and jails. Maybe there's some intervention points where we can think about ebbing some of the negative effects. And so what's sort of most applicable to the current discussion is the political consequences of the expansion of the justice system. And they have been meaningful. You can make some assumptions, and those assumptions look like, well, how would this group vote? Or is this mathematical equation correct? And I can debate, we can talk about those assumptions, but if you buy those assumptions, the math is easy. There's been a reallocation of power in the United States, and the criminal justice system is one of the ways that that's been done. So let's just think broadly about, about what I'm talking about. I'm talking a little bit less about incarceration status and a little bit more about felony status. So when we think about voting restrictions in the criminal justice system, most of the time it's tied to felon status, and that's complicated. Not all felony convictions result in a spell of incarceration. Not all incarceration, in particular, and some of the other panelists will talk, not all incarcerations, like jail, result in even convictions. Voting restrictions are most often tied to felony status, and we know a lot more about incarceration. So about 5 years ago, my colleagues and I tried to calculate how many felons are there in the United States. And it's a challenge because people are reincarcerated, because people are felons who have not been incarcerated, people move, people pass away, and people sort of go off paper. And so a bunch of equations that I can talk about. We published a paper in Demography, thanks to the next slide, and the national snapshot emerged. From about 1980 to about 2000 in the United States, felon status emerged as a defining feature of the American political and social landscape. About 20 million felons, and I say it's a bit dated because this was a 2017 paper. So about 20 million felons. And demographically, it's not, of course, distributed evenly. It's focused in certain groups. So among certain demographic groups, we reached a point in the early 2000s where incarceration was as common as college graduation, and approximately 1 in 3 African Americans without a high school degree were going to be incarcerated at some point in their life. So this had a transformative impact on American society. I would add it often had a hidden impact on American society because we omitted most of the incarcerated individuals from household surveys. So we took them out of the numerator and the denominator in most of the equations. Go ahead, hit it. Yeah, thanks. So I'm sorry, back one, my apologies. When we think about criminal justice and voting, it's a patchwork. So as of November of 2022, there's considerable state variation. 48 states have some form of restriction, and that constitutes about 2% of the adult male population in the United States, about 1 in 50 adults in the United States. Constitutes about 4.6 million as of November of 2020. I would add that that's down about 20% from 2016 when we had a high of about 6.1. The vast majority are not incarcerated in prisons. That's why this felon number is really important to think about. Without considering any racial variation, about 8% of adults in Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee have restrictions. And Florida is by far the national leader in felony disenfranchisement, where over 1 million people cannot currently vote, or could not currently vote because of restrictions. It looks something like this, a patchwork of American society, right? So many states in the yellow, you can't vote if you sort of on paper. And then we see some of the most punitive states, typically in the South or in the West, where you cannot vote at all. And we'll talk a little bit about, there'll be some emerging changes in these areas. But sort of the disenfranchisement looks like this across America, but it's racially concentrated, of course. It's racially concentrated, it's demographically concentrated, and it's geographically concentrated. I mentioned 1 in 3 African-American men, but it's not just racially concentrated, it's demographically concentrated. We looked at where people live after they got out of prisons, and African-Americans came from the most disadvantaged communities and returned to the most disadvantaged communities. So there was no downward mobility because we were sort of at the bottom of the scale. So it's the most disadvantaged communities see the biggest impact of incarceration. And I would add that institutional and organizational practices matter. There's a different landscape in Florida. than there is in Oregon. There's a different landscape in Wisconsin than there is in Texas because we have the ability to change and make policies that impact the laws and the practices of our state. I wanted to quickly sort of transition to what it looks like by race. So that's the exact same, the same, obviously the same country, but we're breaking down now by the percentage of people who have felony records by race. Okay, so and you see both in California and in Florida, 20% of African American men have felony convictions, felony records, but the implications for voting for those two states is quite different. In Florida, it's a lifetime ban. To be clear, there's a ballot initiative. We can talk about the changing of the ballot initiatives, but we see approximately 20% of African Americans in many states like Indiana, California, Florida, with 20% felony conviction rates of 20%. And it's not just states that have high 20s, right? It's states of 10, 15% of the population with felony conviction in given demographic groups. So the implications, a reshaping of American democracy. We don't even have to talk about the Florida election of 2000, right? 500 votes. But the smaller the denominator, the smaller the number on the bottom, the more the changes to the numerator matter. And so when you think about senatorships and governorships, think about elections decided by 2 percentage points or less, and think about 25 states right now in the United States disenfranchise 1% of the population. Congressional seats, earlier estimates, Chris's initial paper had 2 governorships and 7 Senate elections in addition to a presidential seat. Those estimates now are, more than 10 senator seats, 5 or 6 governorships, and upwards of 40 or 50 congressional seats, right, have been shifted because of restrictions on voting. The implications of not counting folks, not counting folks in prisons are quite consequential, and I want to just take 1 second to talk about that. In 2008, it was widely established that Barack Obama, African American, the black vote, swept Obama to the presidency. Some folks like Becky Pettit and some demographers did some recalculating and found that once you account for rates of incarceration, the actual African American percentage voting, the civic participation, was no different than in the 1960s. So that the argument that Becky and some other folks have made is that the prison has eroded most of the effects of political participation of the Civil Rights Act. And we can debate and talk about how we get to those numbers, but the math is pretty clear, and it's not that complicated. I would close by highlighting 3 emerging trends. First, against a backdrop of fewer individuals are being denied the right to vote. The evidence is clear. From about 2016 to 2022, we went from about 6.1 million Americans to about 4.6 million. As a criminologist, we couldn't be any more clear. We want to encourage civic participation. We want to encourage people to vote, and the logic is pretty simple. We want people to care about society. We want engaged citizens, and there's considerable evidence that voting is associated with movement away from criminal behavior, right? People who are more engaged in society are more likely to be vested in the given society. So the 3 trends. There's a definite public move to restore voting rights. Public opinion, by and large, is supportive of restoring rights to felons when a sentence is complete. There is little evidence of public support for blanket bans. And I would add that this is supported by electoral outcomes, right? There was a referendum in Florida, and a citizen-led referendum, and they universally voted. I shouldn't say universally, they voted, I think about 70% to restore the rights to people when they have completed their sentence. So in public, there's sort of a move to restore voting rights. The political landscape, as others will talk about, is extremely complicated, and it's mixed. There's some executive action in places like Kentucky, Iowa, and New York, where governors said, you can vote. And many states adopted progressive policies to restore rights. 7 states eliminated lifetime bans. But there were also some counter trends, places like Tennessee, places like Florida, where there were definitional changes to make things appear more restrictive. In Florida, for instance, there was a ballot initiative, and individuals got the right to vote when their sentence was completed. And the Florida legislature changed the definition of a sentence to include all fines and fees. And so they managed a workaround. I would also add, and I am not well positioned to talk about it, other people are, I think we do see, as a criminologist, it interests me, a shift away from democracy somewhat. We're fighting a little bit more about whose vote to count, when you can count, what votes to count. And there's a long history of that in the political, I apologize. There's a long history in the political justice system of criminal justice involvement with voting, right? And we can think about the 15th Amendment in 1880, which we're still fighting about, 1870, which we're still fighting about today, and is still being legislated in courts in Shelby v. Holder and with people, you know, with members of our panel and audience. And I would say, I would conclude by saying the last trend I would highlight, and this is with some colleagues, thank you, this is with some colleagues here. Jason Roby was a student of mine who is now a professor at Penn State, and Mike is a faculty member here. Incarceration has meaningfully declined in the United States. And when I say meaningfully, I do mean meaningfully. Nationally, incarceration has gone down about 20%. And when I'm talking, I want to be clear, we're cheating just a little bit. I'm talking about from the peak. So the peak in Wisconsin was a little bit different than the peak in Texas, and the peak in Texas was a little bit different than the peak in Washington. But from our highest rates nationally, we've gone down about 20% nationally. The groups that have been most impacted by the justice expansion have seen the greatest decline. There's been a decline for Black men across all 50 states. On average, that decline has gone down 44%. I want to be clear that substantively means in one generation, the lifetime risk is halved, right? It's gone from 1 in 3 to about 1 in 5. And of folks born in 2001, college is more likely than incarceration for African-American men. This is notable. It's been in the Washington Post, it's been in Wisconsin Public Radio, all in the last 2 or 3 months the study was published. It's not a red state, blue state trend at all. Texas, African-American incarceration is down 55%. It's down 35% in Kansas. And I would add, people ask why. We don't really know why. There's a lot of things that have happened. But it has created some very unique partnerships. Some very conservative groups that think we spend too much money, with some very liberal groups that think we have too many punitive criminal justice systems. So it's created some unique partnerships, and I will just close with a few very quick specifics, just so folks can see visually what it looks like. I'm a quantitative criminologist, so we do most of the work with numbers. That's the decline. It's halved for Black men in one generation. And then could you just slide one? And this is impossible. I would yell at my students if they did this. But this is every single state from its peak, how much it's gone down. So you could look at any state. So Texas has gone down from its peak 55% in 1991. Tennessee, 1999. South Dakota's gone down 45% since its peak in 2005. So we've seen a broad decline, de-incarceration, and the implications of that will start to be felt by the next generation of individuals. And with that, I would just close and acknowledge a lot of colleagues and friends, and I hope I didn't take more than 10 minutes. So thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you, Mike. All right, we're going to go from Michael 1 to Michael 2. This is Milo Owens. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Is this on? I think you told us we need to turn it on.
There's a button, John. Where's the button? Right there.
System's good.
Pull
I guess I should have wore the microphone. Right? Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this great panel this afternoon. I'm just going to say a couple of things because I really would like to get to Q&A as well as maybe some engagement with my colleagues here. I'll just say the first thing for me, I'm a political scientist. And so when I think about voting rights and criminal justice, right, I naturally see the connection between the two. And I'll say something more about that in a second. The emphasis, of course, today is to think about, in essence, barriers to the ballot box. And we know that we can, of course, raise barriers, but we could also find ways to reduce barriers, if not remove barriers altogether. Still, generally, though, we're at the point of thinking still about barriers are high. We've had lots of efforts around the country, though, to try to reduce them. But there are some people who call for the actual abolition of all of these hurdles to the ballot box. The other thing I would say is, in terms of thinking about these barriers, having talked to formerly imprisoned people in face-to-face interviews as part of my research, having facilitated focus groups with formerly imprisoned people as part of my research, as well as doing some other things to try to get a sense of how people who are most impacted by these policies think about how they are impacted. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the idea that we're also talking about barriers to dignity, right? Dignity. Now, I think another starting point we can have is we're in a country that believes that we, in essence, collectively have the right to punish people who have been convicted of crimes, right? Very few people disagree with the idea of punishing people. You know, how you punish them, we might have disagreements about. But the general principle that there is a right of punishment in the United States, I think, is very strong and probably is never going to go away. However, a right to punishment does not also equal the right to punitiveness. And I think we need to always make a distinction between these two things. Much of what we're going to consider this afternoon is really less a conversation about punishment and more a conversation about punitiveness. Punishment, authorized, intentional, reprobative harm, right? Punitiveness, punishment that exceeds reason. And we have lots of ways of thinking about how barriers to the ballot box for people with criminal records, we could use your classification, the felon class. Lots of reasons to think about how these barriers actually exceed reason, given all the good things that we know are associated with the restoration of the right to vote to people, as well as, right, for us who have never had our right to vote ever taken away. Punishment that exceeds reason, works against civic redemption, right? When we think about this conversation, there also is the matter of having paid one's debt to society, which apparently we still argue over, right? What that even means. Again, we'll keep referring to Florida. This is the greatest example of this, where there's great debate over what it means to say that someone has paid their debt to society. But I would also bring in, again, this point about dignity, that punitiveness ultimately as punishment results in a disrespect of human dignity. And if you talk to many formerly imprisoned people about the matter of voting rights, if you really listen to what they're saying, even if they don't use the word dignity, that is what they're getting at. They're getting at matters of regard, matters of self-esteem, matters of individual responsibility, but more importantly, individual autonomy and their ability to participate in civic life. Now, as a political scientist, Barry will not be surprised what I'm about to quote. Although I think what Laswell was, Laswell, why am I blanking on this? If Laswell was a political scientist or a sociologist, we'll just put that aside for now. I'm just getting old. That's all that really is, right? But I do remember, right? Politics. Who gets what, when, and how, and where. And in this consideration this afternoon, I want us to also be clear that we're talking about distributive politics, right? Voting rights are greatly consequential to matters of representation, and we assume that they are greatly important to matters of responsiveness, where even within the concept of responsiveness, there is this idea of regard. Government regards some of us, disregards others of us. When it regards us, it is more responsive, right? Basic ways of thinking about this. And if I'm sitting here saying who gets what, when, how, and where, and this is distributive politics, then it's easy for us to think about how we're now at the intersection of the theme of the panel, voting rights and criminal justice in the United States. I'm also interested in this idea that the intersection of voting rights and criminal justice in the United States is about distributive politics because it allows us to begin to think about, or at least remind ourselves, what gets distributed in American society. And in the case of this conversation, what generally gets distributed is matters of benefit, but also burden, right? And that's what our distributive politics do all the time. It's assigning benefits to some, and it's assigning burdens to others, making things more difficult for people to fulfill themselves as democratic citizens, democratic with a small d, of course. What shapes the distributive politics? Well, of course, policymakers are shaping the distributive politics. In the ideal sense, the policies they make are in fact informed and influenced by us, but the us is never really us. The us is always like some groups who have more influence. And so it means that we also would need to pay attention to matters of group position and differences in power among groups in society, if we want to understand why we're even sitting here in this room this afternoon talking about the intersection of voting rights and criminal justice. Voting rights. On the one hand, I guess this afternoon we're going to be talking about the voting rights of those who have them. And I think we should not forget, right? Much of this conversation and the reality of how we think about and see what is disenfranchisement, what is collateral consequences, is largely a function of those who have the right to vote, influencing those who want to be responsive in some way, shape, or form to those that they most regard. But of course, if we're talking about voting rights today specifically, we also mean those who do not have the right to vote. Criminal justice policy includes both punishment and punitiveness. And in thinking again about punishment and punitiveness, it allows us to also think about the concept of just deserts, which goes, of course, back to the idea of when is one paid one's debt. But putting that aside, there is the idea that we have these policies because we assume that it has some sort of civic purpose in mind, where one of those purposes is to give people their just deserts for the wrongs that they have been accused of and been convicted of. All of this, of course, makes it very easy, I think, for policymakers who favor punitiveness to not necessarily have to fight very hard to sustain the policies that produce disenfranchisement out there in the world. And again, for those that are really interested in favoring punitiveness, I think is the important point here. And that's partly because, of course, to borrow from some other political scientists, they say that we should be focusing on, this is Ann Schneider and Helen Ingram, they said we should be focusing on two dimensions in terms of understanding how any groups get what they get in America, or perhaps anywhere in the world. We're again thinking I can get benefits, or you can get some burdens. And the first dimension is, how do we collectively perceive your group or you as an individual, positively or negatively, right? Do we think you're trusting or distrusting? Are you good? Are you bad? Are you moral? Are you immoral? But of course, policymakers aren't just operating from that perspective. I assume that they're also operating from a political perspective that's about political capital. Who has political power? And if we combine these two dimensions together, it allows us to understand why it is more hard for people with criminal records and formerly imprisoned people to get more benefits than burdens out there in the world. But we have these moments too where we have seen what's referred to as non-congruent policymaking, where a group that we normally would think should not receive benefits, instead should be getting burdens, actually receive benefits rather than burdens, allowing us to recall too that, right, how we perceive groups and the degree to which groups have power can change over time. Some evidence, though, of this point of non-congruent policymaking, and to be clear, many of us, in fact, support it. And I don't just mean us sitting here. I mean, many of us in this room, I imagine, many people in the United States. How do we know that there is support among us for the idea that we should be lowering the barriers to the ballot box for formerly imprisoned people, and maybe even for people in prison. One way we know this, of course, is surveys, which our colleague has referenced, right? And that's what we normally go to. Look at the surveys. And the surveys are awesome because they demonstrate the same finding over and over and over again when it comes to the matter of collateral consequences, and not just with regards to restoring the right to vote and voting rights, but also with regards to social rights, right? Restoration of the ability of formerly imprisoned people to receive access to TANF, for instance, temporary assistance to needy families. We also know that there's support too for things that maybe aren't quite civil rights, but at least fit within the broader category of, right, like the right to be a laborer unimpeded by one's criminal record in American society. What's my evidence of that? The rise of the Ban the Box movement, right, to remove from applications questions about criminal records. If you look at public opinion related to those three big categories, you generally find that the public is in support of those policies, which suggests that many of us actually are still, right, we believe in punishment, but there's something that we see unfair about punitiveness, which we normally associate with these policies. The second place that I would point to as evidence for our general public support for trying to lower the barriers. We keep referencing Florida, rightly referenced Florida in 2018. But we can reference other places where the question of should the right to vote be restored after prison, whatever we mean by after prison, or like probation, parole, all these things. When you put that to the public on the ballot box and they go vote, what do? They tend to vote in very high percentages in favor of a policy that would reduce barriers and that would begin to weaken the idea that punitiveness should be a norm within public policy making. We could go back and focus on not Florida. We could go back 1986 to 2006. There were multiple referendums related to this question in the state of Rhode Island. First, it was a matter of, right, people who are completely off paper, right? You've done all of your community supervision. That was the first time it was on the ballot. Public was like, yes, restore the right to vote. And then every subsequent time, it was just looking at a different element of the felon class, right? With an eye towards restoring the vote. We can go back to California, 1972, 1973. That too, we see it being put on the ballot. What happened? Majority of people favored it. And I learned in the last couple of years that I have a project focusing on Hawaii, of all places. But that's because I have a project on Ban the Box, where in terms of the states that did this thing that we refer to as Ban the Box in a very serious way, it was Hawaii. But I discovered that 10 years after Hawaii was admitted as a state, it decided to revisit, if we want to use that word, state constitution. So it had a constitutional convention where any issue can come up for consideration. What issue came up for consideration in 1968? Should Hawaii allow people after they have been released from prison to vote? Now, it was put to a general question, it's like the whole thing passed, right? But it was there, embedded. People could have made a big deal about this and said, no, take that piece out. But no, there it is. Final thing I want to say, that generally, if we look at public opinion in terms of surveys, strong support that policymakers should generally be doing something different. But again, it raises the issue, why are they not being responsive to what public sentiment is? Referendums, overwhelming support when put to the ballot. So we generally know that when things are put on the ballot, with regards to this matter at least, we really should expect more victories than defeats. Even if in the case of, say, Florida, right, there are new issues arise that limit the scale of the victory, if you will. But in all of these efforts, in particular to try to get these questions placed on the ballot, what's been critical and important, as well as what's been critical and important once people have the right restored, to try to get them to use their vote, to mobilize them, has been the role of civil society. And I think that we shouldn't leave civil society out of the question, because every place where we've seen victory, or even every place we've just seen good struggle, there are really interesting, competent, serious human-loving people pushing very hard to try to ensure that public policy does fall more in line with public sentiment on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Milo. On to Naila Awan.
See if that works properly. All right. Oh, I don't need both. That feels like a lot. So criminal legal disenfranchisement has multiple forms, right? And as we've been talking about today, one of the things that oftentimes comes up in this discussion is the issue of felony disenfranchisement, a practice that a 2022 report from the Sentencing Project estimated results in Black adults of voting age being excluded from the voting process at 3.5 times the amount of other adults of voting age as a whole. Notably, felony disenfranchisement not only has a racially disparate impact today, but the laws were first developed as a response to the abolition of property holding requirements and to reduce political participation of Black voters. In some places, the actual original design of these policies shows that that was the exact intent, right? If you look at Mississippi and its first design of its felony disenfranchisement scheme, they decided that if a person committed murder, they were not deprived of the right to vote. That was an conviction that tended to be hit more hardly on the white population in the state. However, if a person was convicted of theft or stealing food, something that Black individuals in the state were convicted of at higher rates, they were deprived of their right to vote. We've never really gone back and revisited why these laws started to begin with and like the kind of racist history that's baked into them. And I think that that's just important to acknowledge. It's also possibly not surprising, given this, that the states of Maine and Vermont are the two that never really established felony disenfranchisement, the two whitest states in the country, if you look at census data, right? So felony disenfranchisement is kind of one bucket. And I know that Michael's going to be speaking more about Amendment 4 in Florida. A second time that oftentimes gets overlooked, but where people are also explicitly barred from democratic participation is misdemeanor disenfranchisement. There's slightly over a handful of states where individuals, while they are convicted of a misdemeanor, are not allowed to vote while they are incarcerated. And I think that some of the discussions that happen around ending felony disenfranchisement, the movement around abolishing felony disenfranchisement more broadly that we've seen progressing in different states, sometimes leaves out the conversation around misdemeanor disenfranchisement, leaving this kind of threat that you might actually end felony disenfranchisement and not realize that folks in jails for misdemeanors are still going to be deprived of their right to vote. So it's important to kind of look at the full scope of it. But aside from those issues, what I'll spend most of my time talking about today is de facto disenfranchisement, which is not a legal bar to voting, but rather refers to disenfranchisement that eligible voters experience when they're detained in a carceral facility. While some people in prisons do retain the right to vote, this form of disenfranchisement most often occurs when people are detained in our nation's 3,116 local jails. Currently, it's estimated that approximately 514,000 individuals are locked up in jails. Of those individuals, 427,000, or about 83%, are detained pre-trial. So unless those individuals are already barred from voting based on the fact that their state has a felony disenfranchisement scheme that says that if they had a past felony conviction, they cannot vote, those individuals, as well as most of the individuals in these jails that are being held for misdemeanors, remain entirely qualified to vote in their state, but they're often barred from doing so based on barriers that exist to the ballot box. In 1974, the Supreme Court took on a case called O'Brien v. Skinner. And that case stated that the Constitution demands that qualified voters who were detained pre-trial or on misdemeanor convictions in a state where individuals detained for those reasons can continue to vote and were denied in-person voting options had to be provided with the opportunity to cast an absentee ballot. However, despite the fact that this came up in the early 1970s, still today, there's so many barriers that prevent people who are in jail from being able to exercise their right to vote. And that's not just election laws, right? It's election laws, it's election infrastructure, it's jail policies and practices, and it's general misinformation that pervades the jails that really work together to prevent people from being able to meaningfully exercise their voting rights. So, for example, in 2019 or before 2019, Georgia had a law in place that prevented individuals who were in jails from receiving a ballot at the jail that they were incarcerated in if they were incarcerated in the county where they lived. That was an issue that got brought up in a case called Swan versus Georgia Secretary of State. That case was ultimately dismissed on standing grounds, but I do think that it actually helped propel the change in the law that we've seen in Georgia, where individuals can now receive the ballots in the jails where they are. Voters who are detained after the deadline for requesting an absentee ballot and then held through the election also find themselves unable to cast a ballot, right? This came up in a case in Ohio called Mays v. LaRose. The technicalities around that lawsuit involved kind of how the law structured confined voters and comparing two different classes. So I'm not going to go into it right now, but it is just another sort of election law barrier that can exist that prevents people from being able to exercise their right to vote. The sort of restrictions that were at issue in those cases are only some of the hurdles. And so I want to kind of go through a couple of the other barriers that folks experience. First, there might be misunderstandings or misinformation around detainees about whether they qualify to vote. I've personally spoken to folks. I know people who go into jails and do voter registration or absentee ballot application efforts. And individuals think because they are detained in a jail, they do not qualify to vote. They don't know that they can request and receive a ballot in the jail. So like that is just a major informational barrier that exists. Also, you don't always know what information the jails are providing. During the Mays v. LaRose case in the discovery process, what we found out was that Franklin County Jail, which is situated in the capital of Ohio, right? It's one of the larger jails in the state, was putting on closed circuit television information that was incorrect about people's voter registration qualifications. They said, if you have ever formally been convicted of a felony in the state of Ohio, you do not qualify to vote. That is patently false. In Ohio, if you have a past felony conviction, your right to vote is restored upon release from incarceration. They were also telling people, if you haven't voted in the past 4 years, you do not qualify to vote. Also patently false in Ohio. So the limited information people were receiving in the jail was also incorrect. And sometimes it's really hard to know when this misinformation is being provided unless you're doing public records requests, engaging with sheriffs, etc., because there's just not real clarity into what is happening in these instances. Election rules also are establishing barriers. We've already talked about the deadlines for being able to request an absentee ballot, but also in some states, you have to have a notary who signs your absentee ballot envelope. That can be a major barrier for people who are incarcerated, or restrictions on who can hand deliver ballots or how many ballots an individual can hand deliver. Then if we think about the way that election law rules coincide and intermingle with jail policies and procedures, that often can create some insurmountable hurdles. For example, whether a postmark or delivery deadline for ballot registration and registration forms can be met may depend on whether or not jails are actually treating election-related mail in an expedited fashion. If election mail is not postage prepaid, that can be a major issue if people don't have funds in commissary. Or in some cases, I've talked to individuals who, between the time that they were detained in the election, commissary wasn't open. So even if you had the funds, you couldn't pay for a stamp, at which point you can't get anything out. And then if an ID is needed, for example, if a copy of a photo ID needs to be submitted to request an absentee ballot, those IDs are held by the jails. So you have to make sure that the jails are actually providing individuals with these IDs. Beyond those issues, if you start to think about a move that we've seen in a lot of jails, which is the move to mail scanning, that can also create a big issue. Oftentimes jails are now taking mail, sending it off-site, having it scanned, and then people only receive a scanned copy of their mail. These policies oftentimes don't do anything to address election-related mail. So that means an individual might get just a scanned copy of their ballot, which they then cannot actually vote. So it's really important to look at ways to alleviate these burdens and like have a basic understanding of what's actually happening in the jail and what the practices are, and an understanding of the processes or allowances that exist in a state that could make jail voting easier. And what I mean by that is there are some jails, for instance, one in California that is providing tablets where automatic or online voter registration is available. And these tablets are being provided for free. So individuals are able to register more easily at the jail, assuming you have the information you need to be able to use the online voter registration tool. Also, some states allow for requests for absentee ballots to be submitted by mail, fax, or electronic submission. Doing this means that individuals don't have to worry about kind of the delays that happen with mail processing, and they don't have to worry about stamps, right? So that removes some of those burdens. It's also possible to provide things like prepaid calls to a specific number, like your local board of elections, to ensure that people can get questions answered and identify if there were problems with their ballot. In 2020, the organization I was at prepaid to establish a voter hotline for voters in Georgia jails. We contacted the phone service providers, figured out who was providing the services, established a toll-free number, and then sent Know Your Rights things into Georgia jails when they were closed, so that individuals could then reach out to us and let us know if they were having a problem voting from jail. So that is something that can very easily be set up. And what I want to say too is, like, obviously absentee voting and increasing access to absentee voting is enormously important. It is important in ensuring that the rights of individuals also who might be jailed from a different county are able to exercise their rights. But because of the deadlines, what a lot of states have been doing is trying to establish, or a number of counties have been trying to do, is establish polling locations or in-person voting, which will address the kind of late jailed voter issues. And when these have been made available, what we have seen is a marked increase in the participation numbers. For instance, in Cook County in 2022, individuals in jail voted at a higher rate than registered voters in the city of Chicago, right? In Harris County, it established a pilot program in 2021 that was quite limited in terms of who could use it. They estimated that 100 people were able to make use of the pilot program. Of that 100 people, 96 people voted. That's a 96% participation rate, right? This is like enormously high numbers if you're thinking about election participation. So really what we need to be doing is thinking through all of these different mechanisms, how they work together, and really getting a better understanding of what is happening in jails, because they vary from county to county, right? The practices in one county might be completely different from the practices in a neighboring county in the same state. So it creates a very complicated process sometimes. But I'm thrilled that it's an issue that seems to have been coming more and more to the surface. And like a lot of groups are advancing across the country in terms of trying to establish either polling locations or really engaging in jail voting advocacy work.
Thank you, Nyla. And as we shift to our final speaker, Michael Morse, I want to remind you about questions. If you've got cards, raise your hand and we'll collect them and try to squeeze in some questions before the panel wraps up. We'll also have a reception at the end, so please hang around and nag the panelists with your questions there. And if you're online, please use the Q&A function. And I will give the CLA code after Michael Morse provides his commentary. Michael, on to you.
Okay, I can try to go fairly quickly. I wanted to use my time to talk about what I see as like one current approach to reform here and one current challenge to reform. I think the current approach that I'm most interested in are bipartisan coalitions for reform. The current challenge that I think is most pressing is court fines and fees. So we've talked a little bit so far through the maps to learn a little bit about how the number of people who can't vote because of a criminal conviction swelled, right, from 2 million to 6 million. Now it's maybe about 4.5 million. We've seen maps about how felon disenfranchisement is partisan. And I think I want to focus a little bit about what the implications are. So about 50 years ago, the Supreme Court held that felony disenfranchisement is generally constitutional. And I think the implication of that is that reducing the scope of disenfranchisement, where it's concentrated, particularly in the South, depends on building bipartisan coalitions. And those coalitions depend on addressing the expectation that reform would dramatically benefit the Democratic Party. And I think as we think about coalitions, one of the most difficult, more complicated things is as we've gotten the explosion of mass incarceration, we've also gotten an explosion in court fines and fees, and it's changed the nature of what we mean by a sentence. Does a sentence include fines and fees? So I'm glad that we've talked about Amendment 4. We've learned a little bit basically about it was a ballot initiative to take Florida that used to disenfranchise people for life and automatically restore their right to vote upon completion of all terms of sentence. I studied the campaign, the aftermath, the fight about the legislation, and I think I just want to offer 3 takeaways about how the campaign could impact the future of reform. I think the first is that reform is possible, right? So the campaign for Amendment 4 did something remarkable. They won a bipartisan victory in Florida. And I think it's helpful to understand that they needed a 60% support. That was a real constraint. When we talk about this issue, we often have focused on the racist history of these laws. That's completely true. We've also focused on the disparities that these laws produce. Also completely true. But the campaign for Amendment 4 didn't talk about any of that. They purposely didn't. They talked more about redemption, about trying to forgive, about this slogan, when a debt is paid, it's paid. That may have, we'll talk about that. But they made a strategic and a narrative choice. And it worked there. And one of the things that I showed is that 40% of Republicans supported reform. And it was people who lived in poorer areas, and it was people who lived in more diverse areas, which was quite promising, I think, from the campaign standpoint. I think despite that bipartisanship, right, if we think that the public supports reform, seems like they do not only in Florida, but across the board, the legislature does not seem to support that, right? The legislature was very partisan in how they thought about Amendment 4. Amendment 4 said we will restore the right to vote upon completion of all terms of sentence, did not define what all terms of sentence meant. The Republican legislature unanimously, like all Republicans voted to include fines and fees, all Democrats did not. There's been some discussion today about kind of the partisan implications, and I think we use partisan implications to tell us sometimes that this issue is important. And I think it is important for many reasons, mainly for the dignitary harms. But I don't think the partisan implications are as strong as we think they are. I think they're overstated. One reason why I think they're overstated is I don't think we always do a great job of thinking about who is impacted. So kind of what we're saying, right? There are so many people who have a felony conviction. If you think about this as disparities, you may think of this only as an issue, let's say, that impacts like African Americans only, and you may think a lot of Black people support the Democratic Party. This is a Democratic issue, but it's not. In Florida, only a quarter of people who stood to regain the right to vote are Black. And a lot of people supports the Republican Party. So part of what I want to do is start to think that the implications here may not be as partisan, and perhaps in the Q&A we could address why. And I think in the last part, I'm trying to go quickly here. I think it is important to think about the role of fines and fees in crafting reform. And I think it is easy to tell the story that after Amendment 4 was passed, there was a story of partisan advantage. One party saw that if we expand the right to vote, it may harm our party, so let's restrict the right to vote. But I also want to say, maybe not popularly, that the campaign made a strategic error. The campaign did not fully appreciate, and it makes sense why, they drafted the language in 2014. Ferguson was only right about then. The extent of fines and fees. It is not something we can trade off to gain support. So when you look at court records, we think that the typical person owes $1,000, $1,100. They are not able to pay this. So currently, Florida is this story of great reform and great failure, right? 80% of people still can't vote. And so I think the question is, what do you do from there? And I think what you do from there is you can't compromise on fines and fees. You have to explicitly address fines and fees. You can't restore the vote upon completion of a sentence. You can't say a sentence without telling us what you mean by that. You probably can't have a slogan about when a debt is paid, it's paid, because it could be taken literally. And it was taken literally. I think ultimately what you need is a thicker narrative of redemption. Redemption, the way the campaign ran it, was really about personal responsibility. But the obstacle now is structural, right? The obstacle is that the fines and fees are unjust, that they cannot be paid back. And in order to think about that, you have to educate people on what the fines and fees are for, things very unrelated to the offense. And I think what I want to encourage people to think about is that we often attack disenfranchisement as a collateral consequence, right? We're challenging the fact that because of a criminal conviction, you can't vote. But I think we're going to have more success just challenging the criminal justice policy straight on, which is that we fund the system in part on fines and fees. And if you care about voting, you may want to just care about criminal justice policy as such and think about the policy. And that may be where we have to think about policy reform. So with that, I'll close. And this was a great panel.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, before questions, back to that CLE issue I mentioned at the outset. If you are online and would like CLE credit, now is the time to take advantage using the Google form link, which is in the Zoom chat. You will enter the passcode word justice, Justice. Case does not matter. Mix it up for fun. It's a Friday afternoon. Justice is the word, so please enter it in the form. You have till 5 p.m. Central Time. All right, let's see if we can move through a few questions quickly. One is a question about whether restoring voting rights to people in the criminal justice system might be in the public's best interest. There was no discussion here of recidivism or reintegration into society. Is there some evidence or argument that providing the right to vote actually encourages people to become involved in their communities and has some other beneficial consequences for society at large? Whoever would like to take that.
I can be very quick. Yeah, there's considerable evidence. Part of the reason that we encourage kids to get involved with schools and clubs is that participation forms bonds and it forms a sense of community and you care about things. And so there's evidence that causal models are hard to design, but there's all sorts of associations and anecdotal evidence in surveys and Chris Hugan and a number of folks have looked at work that, yeah, voting is associated with decreases. And when I say decreases, I mean change from prior levels, change in criminal behavior and a host of pro-social outcomes. Yeah. At least from a criminological, sociological perspective. Yes.
Milo.
The only thing I would add to that is all of that is true, but we could still raise the question of who cares, right? What does it really matter if there are these civic consequences that are positive or not? It's either a right or it's not, right? Generally what we have is a system of grace, where we have policymakers bestowing grace. And in the states where it's not written in the Constitution or it's not firm, we know what happens. One governor goes out, the other governor comes in, and we're still back to this question of, will grace be given? Will grace be granted? So I think that's just like a starting point. The other thing is related to this, well, are there these civic consequences? In particular, people always are most interested in, well, do we see people when they get the right to vote restored? Are they voting? And this goes back to the point too of like why Republicans should be like worried about this. because we have incredible evidence that most people, when the right to vote is restored, they're not using it. And that is okay too, right? We were chatting about this before we started. Like, how many of us know people who've never had their right to vote taken away who don't use it? So why is this the standard for someone who had their right taken away because of a criminal offense? So I just want to add some complexity to the conversation.
Real quickly, speaking some complexity, very seldom I say a fact or something criminologically, and people say, "Oh, well, that's bad policy," and you say, "Oh, yeah, it is." Like, we know we do lots of things that are bad criminologically. So yeah, I mean, very smart to point that out.
Other quick thoughts on this one?
I would just add that, I think there've been studies that have come out about like individuals feeling more connected to their community and that helping reduce recidivism. I've been at conferences before because, around Amendment 4, which we've talked about, a lot of people use the term returning citizen, right? I've heard folks say, do not call me a returning citizen if you're not giving me the rights of citizenship back.
Huh.
And so I think that just really shows that like this is something that makes people feel more tied to their communities. And I don't want to overlook the fact that like voting is kind of a learned behavior. If you're exposed to it, if you're going to the polls with your parents, et cetera, that can lead to people voting and be more involved in civic engagement as they get older. And so really there's also like this rollover effect on communities that are over policed and over incarcerated that can occur because of this as well. So it has broader ramifications.
So Bailey, could I just add one thing as a nod to my colleagues? They talked a lot about dignity and how you feel. We've seen considerable evidence that you ask people who voted, I feel more like an adult. I feel more like I fit. I feel more like it. So there's some internal, like we've seen data evidence to suggest that.
Yeah, so there's been some conversation in Wisconsin and elsewhere about the cash bail system. It's in place here. I don't know if Nyla is the best person to address this question. What's the interaction of that policy and voting rights for people who are, say, in jail?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll actually say like in our, when we were having our election day hearing on our temporary restraining order in the Mays case, right? The judge was actually really interested in this too, because our clients were in jail because they hadn't been able to post bail. Some like at least one of them, maybe both, had the charges against them ultimately dropped, but they were going to be disenfranchised because they weren't able to meet a certain dollar amount that the court had set. And I think that given what we're seeing, what we've seen in recent years around just broader litigation around the cash bail system, that's also like really a hook that courts could potentially be interested in too, in terms of determining that some of these restrictions on jail-based voting are really like unconstitutional.
Okay, a couple different questions I'm going to try to put here together. We talked a moment ago, Milo did explicitly about low turnout rates among people who have had their voting rights restored. Nyla gave a couple of counterexamples where some initiatives had been launched in a small way that appeared to have a big effect. But I think the general pattern is low participation rates. Are there things we might do to boost those? And how much of that is the formal barriers in the system and how much is uncertainty? I think some of Michael's work in Iowa and elsewhere demonstrates there's real confusion on the part of policymakers, even poll workers and former inmates themselves who don't know whether their voting rights exist or not, or whether they might get in trouble for doing something. So I wonder if you could say something about just uncertainty and information. How do people get informed about their voting rights?
One basic way that they get informed, towards the end of my remarks, because I briefly touched on the matter of civil society. That's one way in which they get informed. In the introduction of myself, it was mentioned that I serve on the National Advisory Board for the Georgia Justice Project. Georgia Justice Project has been very, like, one of the leaders with regards to trying to make people understand that, as we say there, if you're off paper, you can vote. What's a simple thing that they did? They had T-shirts made. They distributed thousands of T-shirts throughout the state of Georgia in this really garish green color with handcuffs on the back, but open, ballot box. Just providing people with a visual of what it means, right? We don't have to get into the detail, just the visual. And just understanding that seemed to move some people towards wanting to register to vote. And not just themselves, but encouraging others to register to vote, which I think is important. This idea of, people being wrong about information But then there also is the degree to which how some of this might be like mis/disinformation
Mhm.
as well is something that we would really want to try to pay more attention to and get into. There are really great election administrators out there who believe that part of their task is to make sure that every eligible citizen knows not only that they have a responsibility in a broad sense, but how to actually execute that responsibility. And they work very hard to get that information out there. Yet at the same time, there are these other sources of information that are cutting in and undermining to some degree. I think in particular, like in Georgia, one of the big challenges, in fact, has been the degree to which there is not the clearest understanding in many communities of color about this question, where you're left with, well, who do I listen to? Am I going to listen to the government official? Am I going to listen to my homies, right? Who are telling me this, that, and the other thing. But a lot of times the this, that, and the other thing is just wrong, right? And trying to help them to understand, no, you need to stop saying that because that's not the truth. And by you continuing to say that, you're actually not only affecting the person right now, but one thing I loved about Nyla's, one of her points, was the idea that we also need to be thinking about this in terms of intergenerationally as well, right? What are the messages that those who are coming up, who have not reached the point where they, right, by age can vote, register to vote, who are also acting from this wrong information that they too are then communicating in their peer networks, ultimately undermining the broader efforts of the organizations.
You want to add to that, Michael?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say if you look at the landscape as a whole, I think the defining issue is people who are legally eligible to vote and do not know that they are legally eligible to vote. That's promising in one sense because legal avenues for reform here are very slim, right? You fought the legal battle. They actually have the legal right to vote. We're now fighting the implementation battle, the policy battle, the civic battle, which is, in some sense, more promising that we can do that. The study that Barry had referenced showed, I think, the importance of a state intervention. So Iowa restored the right to vote. This is in the past, and sent you a piece of mail, a certificate. You have the right to vote. Here it is. And there were huge participatory effects of that. So just that suggests kind of types of campaigns that could be run. I think it also shows you there are real costs to complexity here. When you think about policy trade-offs, I would take a simple policy, even if it means that fewer people can vote, because simplicity really matters here for information purposes.
And I'll just add too, there was a story out of Kentucky I saw the other day, right? Where Kentucky is, again, one of these places where it's all about race, depending on who the governor is, and that's why the governor's races are like really important from this perspective. But Beshear, right, bestowed grace and also said, hey, there's a website where you can actually look up information. The story suggested, though, that a lot of information might in fact be wrong, or the website is down and people can't use it. So who has stepped in to actually try to make a difference on this in terms of providing information? Formerly imprisoned people themselves in cooperation with varieties of civil society organizations, where they have said that it is up to us to be the ones to ensure that the information is known, that the information is spread.
And Mike.
As a point of order, just our best estimates are formerly incarcerated individuals vote at about rates of half other traditional Americans. I would add rough estimates because rates of voting have gone up. We haven't redone those estimates recently. I also want to just allude that the issue from a criminological perspective is to consider the socio-demographic background of these folks and restrictions on weekend voting, restrictions on voting after 7 o'clock can be very, very problematic for hourly workers, for workers with the demographic profile that lots of people with a history of criminal justice system have. So it's not just about bans, it's about restrictions. And I would say in some cases, what seem to be targeted restrictions. Thank you.
All right, so just a reminder for those of you who are online and want CLE credit, if you don't want credit, that's fine. But if you do, the word is justice to put into the Google form. I think we've come to the end of our formal program, but our panelists will hang around. We'll have a reception here and be glad to have conversation. One issue you should ask them all about we didn't get to is the issue of prison gerrymandering, as it's called. the strategic use of prisons in the drawing of district lines to advantage one side or the other has become an issue and is actually outlawed in some states now. That's just a pet interest of mine. So thanks again to our wonderful panel, to the ERC and to the SDRI for co-hosting, to Stafford for sponsoring, and thank you all for coming out on a rainy Friday afternoon. Thanks again.